Good morning, good evening, greetings, salutations, welcome, all those things above to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I am joined by the mysterious Marvel Mister himself, Russ. How's it going?
It's good. It's good. Another lovely Monday. How are you doing today?
I am doing peachy keen, mighty fine, and I've come up with a third adjective somewhere throughout the episode that I'll throw in. But also doing better because we have so many great people like producer Jeff joining us. Yes, thank you. 10 billion points just for being producer Jeff. And as always, thank you for everybody joining in. Leon and Lewis, everybody having some fun. But for those new joining us, let us take that step back to reintroduce ourselves. So, my name is Tristan Watty, and I am coming to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And Russ, where do you come from?
I come from the Security Incident Response team. So we help you when incidents occur, bad days happen. We'll get you contained, hopefully mitigated, and send you back out on your way.
Yes. Your merry way, right? And
it's
kind of like going to ice cream. It's kind of like going to ice cream. It's a happy hour.
We push you off, and you go down the yellow brick road.
Yeah, exactly. But where did the yellow brick road land you?
Well, I guess in this scenario, I would be positing that I was in fact Oz, which I'm not. I'm just the people that buff you up before you go meet the Oz.
Yeah,
that's me.
Gotcha. And I would like to say to those people, where is everyone from? Dialing in from, tuning in
Don't say
from?
Oz. Nobody say Oz, all right?
Yeah. Say it backwards and then say it forward again. But if you don't want to answer that specific question, we have another fun question that you can answer as well. And that question is, would you rather have your morning coffee replaced with whatever drink a random coworker picks for you, or have lunch decided by a magic 8-ball every day? Russ, where are you going with this one?
Okay, so I love my team, okay, and I trust them with anything except for really small things that would be funny. So I'm absolutely not going to let my team pick anything, and I would just go with the 8-ball. The 8-ball, okay, while it is uncaring and could give you some crazy stuff, at least it's uncaring. My coworkers would be a little more on the mess with me side. So yeah. The 8-ball every day.
So you mean you don't want the wasabi flavored coffee? That's what you're telling me.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Yep. And also, welcome, Curious and Leon joining from England. Welcome in. And how was my weekend? My weekend was fine because it was kind of warm, so I could get outside for walking and also doing all those things that I put off. But I digress. Ari, thank you for watching from LA, where they built Oz. So Oz. I think you missed out at Oz, but I shook the 8-ball and said Oz.
Of course.
Just keep saying it, right? And then it applies eventually.
Right? Yeah, we're going to have to take whatever our theme was for the day, switch it all to references to that.
Yeah, exactly, to Oz. Or we can kind of take a little step back. And what was the episode we came from last time, Russ? What were we speaking about?
Last week was our You Shall Not Pass episode, unless properly scoped, where we discussed AWS permissions and permission boundaries.
Yes.
You normally say you don't have to have watched the preceding episode for you to understand what's going on in this episode. This is a little bit less true, but we'll still give you an overview of what we discussed, or what Tristan discussed last week, and kind of get you in the zone. So that way you don't necessarily have to have watched last week's. But it's a good episode. You should go back and watch it.
Just it's the 5-second spiel on it. We spoke about permission boundary. See, you caught up, right? It's just like last time on the Safe Room Security Side Quest. Tristan went through permissions. Yeah, a little bit. A little drum roll to that? No? Okay.
Did you spend the entire episode screaming as a filler episode? Hopefully not.
Yeah, you know what? Everybody was applauding. I don't know what it was about it, but I digress because today is an expansion on last week's topic. And if you get that reference, 10 billion points to you because we are speaking about, let's see, if we consider our AWS environment a domain, right? How do we expand our domain with least privilege in mind? How do we create that least privilege void, right? With some advanced permission boundary techniques. That's kind of where we're going today. And what do you mean by this? Well, I'll take that pause to say what we're speaking about dramatically is not related to a show with similar concepts, wink, but what we're speaking about is how we can protect our AWS environment, right? Because how do you expand your domain? How do you scale from an AWS perspective, right? Because when you start to scale, you have your AWS organizations, you're accepting, you're merging, you're doing all these different items. But how do you protect with that least privilege peace of mind? And I use peace kind of in two different ways, right? If you saw what I did there. But essentially, if you think of it like one big circle, and everything encompassed in that circle has to follow your rule sets. It has to follow your governance policies, your permissions, your SCPs, everything, all of the above. All the layers of, I want to say onion, but I'm trying not to make that Shrek reference, right? All the layered techniques, right? To make some inescapable boundaries for your developers and personnel when they're, entering and kind of developing within the environment. So, how do you do so? Oh, you have to master the basic techniques, the fundamental techniques, and then build upon them. And I think one way to do this is kind of figuring out, all right, how much can I do by myself and how much can I automate? And I think that's where we lead into our first question, I think, Russ, right? Yep. So what is your biggest concern with automated IAM boundary enforcement? False positives, complexity, lack of human oversight, testing. Pick 1, 2, 3, or 4. Feel free to put it in the chat. And Russ, where do you go with this?
I'm definitely going to go with complexity of maintaining boundary policies as service and teams evolve, especially with teams that are, say, smaller in size or a good case scenario, a smaller company, starts exploding. What used to be a scrappy startup, with only a couple of developers, is now huge. It's hundreds of people, and you have to, update that entire ecosystem to be able to work within that. So I'm going to go with that one.
Yeah. I think that's a good choice. And that's usually what a lot of organizations and of our customers kind of speak of, right? Is how do we keep everything simple? How do we not, overcomplicate things, but make sure we're not missing anything? But Absolutely. I think part of the other side of the fence is, okay, how do we test and validate these items? What is your testing strategy? I think that's where I kind of lean towards 4. Because you can make the most complex rules, permissions, SCPs in the world, but do they work?
Not only do they work, do they work as you intended?
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that's another part of the conversation, right? When you get to, okay, if we're thinking about how permission boundaries work from organization level, and then what is your maximum delegation ceiling or something along those lines. And we kind of spoke about that last week, but the fundamental items, as we back up a little bit more, is taking that step back to look at your policies. I'm going to be here all week, right? When we're speaking about how you take that step back, this is how you expand your domain, is you are looking at, hey, how do I create a space governed by the rules set forth by my organization, right? And that's where permission boundaries start to shine, because they define the absolute outer limits of what, let's say, a delegated principal can do. And that's what we want to touch upon today, is how do we take this one step further beyond? And we mentioned some of the basics of what permission boundaries were last week,
Mm.
but what we're trying to go to next is, hey, how do we take, to Lewis's point, all these different pieces of the layered model of permission boundaries, SCPs, session policies, right, to reduce organizational risk? It's putting all of them together, right? It's, okay, I have user permissions boundaries, that API call, right? Okay, what does it do? It defines the maximum. Okay, good. Next, what? And that next piece is another piece of that layered strategy. So what is your S3 bucket policies? What is your overall SCP strategies? These are all things you have to consider, because when you're developing your target state security strategy, one of the items that I feel is overlooked is how everything kind of comes together, right? Because if you're focusing on service control policies, it's usually hyper focused on SCPs, right? Permission bounds were hyper focused, but you're not seeing the layered approach. And sometimes when you don't see that layered approach, all of a sudden an SCP or something goes into effect and a developer puts in a ticket, hey, I can no longer do something, right? And that usually causes conversations of rollback and why did this happen? Why did it? And yeah. And I think the important pieces of that is understanding, okay, what permission boundaries do and how they interact with, let's say, identity-based policies. So if you think of identity-based policies as granting mechanisms and permission boundaries as filtering mechanisms, right? They don't grant any access themselves. They just, let's say, restrict the scope of what grants from that identity-based policy, if that makes sense, right? So essentially, they're not going to say, hey, grant this person access. No, it's filtering through that piece. So that's an important piece. And Russ, from your side, how much have you seen that kind of ebb and flow where it's, okay, we have a permission boundary, it should be okay, but they didn't really tweak their identity-based policies?
Yeah, that's a common mistake. I think that is exactly for the reason that you bring it up. It's a little bit misunderstood sometimes. And, it's kind of like, for me, and what I see within like an incident event, is it's very similar to like maybe a security group and a NACL versus whatever security networking is going on there. So regardless, my point is that it's that thing where it's kind of confusing because they can be very similar. Like you said, it's filtering, not granting access. So I think that can sometimes be misunderstood and or used in place of things that they're supposed to support. And so that's, I guess, kind of proves your point earlier. Like, are you testing these? Are they working out the way you expect them to? That sort of thing. So I've definitely seen confusion based around this, and especially when it comes to IAM and, exposure of credentials, which is probably one of our biggest. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the problem just grows, right, when you think of it from just a scalability standpoint, right? So as the organization continues to grow, then all of the items that kind of worked in the past, they just stop working, or they become a roadblock, or they become layered in a different way that you don't want, right? Because now you have to kind of unwrap
that. Yay.
Yes. Right? And, it's kind of the word of the day or the year or century, right, is that tech debt, right? Because when you hear that word, you start to feel like, oh, what are all the things that I'm starting to think about? And your heart starts to kind of race a little bit because of that, right? So I think the key component of this is kind of taking that step back and figuring out, all right, if we are here and we're trying to get our organization towards a North Star of security, how do we do so? Well, let's understand some basic fundamental items. What are the layers of an AWS organization? We have this thing with all our multi-accounts. All right, What's the SCP? That I can enable that, right? SCP is the organizational constraint. Permission boundary, delegation constraint, and then identity-based policy is the granting mechanism. So if we understand those three things, then we're kind of halfway almost there, somewhat. But
we're on the
you're on the
bricks are yellow.
Yeah, the bricks just turned yellow at that point. But what you have to continue to do is the scoping component. The I would say it's the documentation pieces of this, right? And that's kind of what it boils down to, where you can have your documentation live in code, but to what extent does it live in the code? Is it explained? Does it tie back to certain things? All those kind of items, right? But you have to have the
Does it list your credentials?
Yeah. So these kind of things are important, especially when you're thinking about it from an organizational standpoint. So if you continue on, right, understanding how much defense in depth is important, especially in a multi-account environment, I think this is one of the most important parts, especially in a multi-account, because even if you have the base solid, you have to understand how all the different workload accounts, right? What is your structure from a dev, UAT, prod? What is your production or promotion process, I should say, right? When it comes to those things. These are all parts of the puzzle because you're not going to have necessarily the same SCPs on your dev accounts as your prod accounts, right? You might be more restricted. Hopefully you're restricted on your prod accounts and your non-prod, right? Because non-prod should mimic prod to some extent, right? But that's a conversation for another day because every organization does it differently. How many times do you run into that? It's like, okay, this is non-production. What is non-production? Oh, it's just prod. If it's a copy of prod, how do I handle that? So, identifying and then also revisiting your policy logic. What I mean by that is how often are you going through and understanding just the fundamentals of IAM policies, right, within your organization, right? There's a great picture diagram of the IAM identity logic within AWS and how everything's evaluated, right? So you have explicit deny in any policy, then it goes SCP allowed check, and then if not, implicit deny, right? Understanding that logic and see if it's still being applied. And what I mean by that is, was something not working? Somebody commented something out because it wasn't working, right? And then it's like, oh, did you check the policy logic? Oh, I skipped a step, right? Because if you have that explicit deny in any policy, SCP, permission, identity, it's always going to win, right? It cannot be overridden, let's say. But this is where understanding your layers and your logic comes into place. And I've seen this a lot where something is not working or we're pushing something into production. Oh, just open the SCP, add an exception, add this role. Right? And how often does that kind of case come to you, Russ? Where it's just like, oh, there's an exception note.
So many times, because it's a very easy mistake to make, especially if you're doing things, I don't know, manually, or, for example, you just don't have systems. So, like, you know, you don't have a team, or excuse me, you don't have a focus on or a process for onboarding new employees. That affects your account and your access. And if you're going to try to scope each IAM, you know, permission set by the individual user, you know, it's not going to scale, but also you're going to make mistakes, right? You know, you put a wildcard star in where it's not supposed to go, and all of a sudden they have administrative access. You know, so it's those types of things that, you know, that show us that all of these processes and stuff are just systems, and these systems have to work together. And, you know, those gaps in between systems and how they integrate are where security teams need to kind of live, right? Because that's where attackers are going to, you know, take advantage of those types of things. So, you know, so when you're thinking about this sort of thing, you have to think, how does our IAM process, even intaking new employees, affect our larger, goal, and like how our SCPs are formed and how everything is formed. I feel like there should be something that we can do, maybe some sort of formalized process to model out like our threats or something like that.
Should be something that it should be a modeling of the threat variety, something along those lines. But little things, right? But I think part of the conversation also boils back to, just like what you said, is what is your onboarding process for new employees? And that's a perfect example, just for a couple different reasons. Is sometimes what happens is it's either like an all or nothing situation where you have all of the access and permissions because, oh, this person's good, they should just have everything. Or you have nothing because they just onboarded and they should have access to the critical systems. But there's a lot of nuances, and I've seen a lot of structures from an identity perspective set up like this, where you have admin, you have power user, and you have read only. And it's like, well, there should be something in between this, right? Because admins, you have everything, or power user, you pretty much have everything except identity creation, those kind of things, those API calls. But you can do a lot. And then read only. I'm like, there's a couple of things missing in there, right? You have a void in your least privilege, but not in the good kind, right? So, Russ, what do you think of that from a void of least privilege perspective?
Yeah, so with the void, within the least privileged void, we try to ensure that no excess or excessive permission can survive. It is a void. Everything goes in and nothing comes out. So just like, how permission boundaries interact with SCPs, session policies, resource-based policies, spoiler alert, but I'm going to go over something regarding that as well. But this is what I mean when I say that they're systems, right? These are layered logic in order to prevent excessive or too overprivileged, that's the word I was looking for, overprivileged access. So these sorts of things like, oops, our intake for employees was messed up and we gave someone who only needed access for not even, for administering in the environment. It was maybe pointed to the wrong account. And so now your HR account is now crossed with your technical account and people are having access in ways that they shouldn't. It's that sort of those where one system fails, the other needs to compensate. And that's what I like to think of the least privilege void as, is kind of that compensating control, I guess. And like that, this is the sort of thing. So like when I was talking about resource-based policies, it's a little bit of a edge case with how resource policies can be, I guess, bypassed by permission boundaries, like granting access directly to like an ARN versus some other consideration, like, assuming a role or whatever. Like that sort of thing, is that edge case. And that's why we have that least privilege void, as we like to call it.
Exactly. And then Maibaka, speaking of this, yes, the name drew you in. And now you are listening to our least privileged void discussion. So yes. Thank you for joining in and making that comment. And I think part of the way too, everything you were just discussing, Russ, is just having an understanding of the different cases within your environment, from the normal to the edge, right? And once you do that, you kind of start to go through all the different permutations of access that is needed, especially from the different accounts, right? From 1 to 100 or whatever the case may be, or multi-account, I should say. But there are certain things that you have to be cautious of. And to your earlier point where IT kind of lives and security lives in those gaps, right? The way I look at that is if you don't fill the gaps, somebody else is going to fill those gaps and they are going to make those gaps bigger for themselves, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to avoid. So using something like, I don't know, pass roll, right? Let's use pass roll. We'll pick on pass roll for a second, right? Where you can have a service kind of assume to do something. If you do not have permission boundaries, this is kind of to your question, Lewis, is, hey, how does a domain expansion impact the scalability and management of permission boundary? Well, it's exactly that. Is if you don't have permission boundaries set up in a certain way, then somebody, let's say a developer, says, hey, I don't have access, but I have the ability to do a pass roll. I can technically pass a role to something like Lambda in order to create, let's say, another role for myself with the correct permissions that I want. And correct, I use those in quotation marks because then they avoided your initial attempts of restriction. And that's that one of those gaps that somebody would live in until you report to them like, hey, why do you have this role, or what does this role do? And that starts to get into monitoring and alerting and things of that nature. So when you go from a practical side, it's understanding those different pieces of the puzzle. And I think it turns into a service discussion as well, right? Russ, is like, what services do you have enabled? And what are your top 3 services that you would check on, right? What are the services that would pop out in your mind when it comes to this discussion?
Yeah, I think that's going to be, the big 3 for us is config, guard duty, and security hub.
Yeah, definitely that. And I think each one of those serves its own purpose. It's like 3 pillars, or, when you're thinking of, hey, what is my North Star? What is my security reference architecture built on? What is the different pieces of how do I start moving towards compliance? And we usually mention these 3 because it's usually the start of your automation process, right? Something is triggered, and then what happens, and where does it flow into? What organization or framework, I should say, are you following? These are all questions that each one of these services can help you figure out, because the way I like to look at it is from a service onboarding perspective. And I know it sounds crazy at first, but if we dial in and really hone in on what a service onboarding process is, right, is you're essentially taking the time out to understand what a service does and what type of restrictions I need to put on said service. So if you say, hey, I want to use EC2 within my environment, great. All right, what API calls does EC2 use? I might not want everybody to create said EC2 instance, so let me create some type of policy that stops that. SCP, hey, if something deviates from this or configuration changes, it's AWS config, or then you start to get in security hub. We could go along those routes, but we're taking that 1,000-foot view of just seeing from a security perspective how these rules start to apply when you start to take things step by step, especially from a service perspective. Mm-hmm. And then to what our use case was before, I have a developer. Okay, permission boundary helps me to filter, i.e. limit, we didn't grant, we're limited that developer to say, hey, you only can do S3 and EC2, right? That's all you can do in this particular manner. Okay, great. You're adding that extra layer of protection in. And the reason why we came up with these use cases and why we went down the path of explaining everything in such detail is because there's, let's say, practical experience, real life experience, legendary experience that came from just understanding all these different points, right? Those transitions, one day I'll get an applause, one day, but then I'll get the fake one. So when you start to think about side quests, they're legends. They're pieces of the puzzle that you are trying to put together piece by piece to understand how, hey, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this. And it's exactly what we have today. Because as SideQuest legend has it, is the place you want to be, where you want to dive in to very loud noises. But also, that woke everybody up. Because when you start to think about SideQuests and legends, this is the segment of the show where we start to delve into that a little bit deeper. Right? So as SideQuest legend has it, has something we call the SideQuest board to help us kind of carve out, yes, all the sound effects today because, it's a fun day. But I take that dramatic pause because usually the music continues to play. But what we're trying to avoid when we're speaking about legends is a certain type of music playing where this is not the happy, upbeat tavern music. This is something happened music.
This is waiting, loading screen music.
Yes, all right. And no, we want to get to the tavern music. So to take that step back and explain a little bit more, SideQuest board is a physical representation of our customer story, of our tale that we are going to tell today that you will participate in or just view. I'll just hold Russ mainly accountable for answering. So what is our tale? Well, we're speaking of, let's say, another healthcare company. We'll continue on from last week's Meridian Health Bridge System. Sounds like a great name because they locked in their data perimeter, right? I think so, maybe. But their main story was, hey, we migrated to a national telehealth. We have electronic health records. We have clinical analytical platforms. We have everything. We also have 24/7 operations coverage, which is great. Well, the problem is we started to scale. We started to acquire. So now we're starting to see if our permission boundaries can meet our needs as we continue to scale. So if we have all these acquisitions, what are we starting to see? We are starting to see maybe cross-account boundary interaction failures. What is that? Well, if we onboard, let's say 30 or 40 new onboarded accounts, right? Okay, they need to assume roles. Well, if they need to assume roles, where do they need to assume them to or from? That is the question. Because now you're starting to deal with, okay, I acquired these and these have to continue to work by integrating into my environment. Now I have all these permission boundaries. Do I have the correct roles? Do I have to carve out new roles? All these questions are asked of, I'll say our adventurers, but our security folk. But the question I asked Russ to start off our journey, say we have an IM model, a delegation model, somebody say. When do you know when your delegation model has hit the breaking point?
When it breaks.
10 billion points to you. So
I don't want the broken points.
So when we think about, okay, delegation model broke, it could be the security team. It could be they are getting excess tickets for something's not working. Hey, my application is no longer working. Or one of those acquired companies, maybe they have a developer that used to have full admin access and now they can't. Well, I'm in the middle of developing something. I need a new release to go live. Oh, maybe the old company had a bunch of IM roles. So what we have now is a broken path between our authenticated users and our AWS environment. So, Russ, how do we sort this out? How do we figure out the right way to a solution here, especially after figuring out our IAM breaking point?
Well, finding out the IAM breaking point, everything's busted. So, okay, so say for example, I got this as a ticket and came up on my desk. The immediate thing I'm going to look at is okay, where did it break? First of all, and why did it break? What was the thing that was different from everything else that works? And that's where you're going to see usually some sort of, permission integration issue, or things just not being really set up at all, and more of that wild card, Wild West wild card, let's call them shenanigans. And then also, just if you find out that things are breaking as they're breaking, first of all, we skipped way past testing and just went to implementing. And then also, what are the things that are breaking? Because basically, especially if you have all these new accounts, do you know everything that is within that account and what it's being used for? Do they have cross-count permissions? That's very common with things like third-party security vendors. They need to be able to access your account to get all those logs to analyze. Things like that that I'm going to look for. And also, because it's a whole new set of accounts that you've acquired, does it fall under your existing SCPs? Is it within your account even? Is it a whole new account that you have to completely redo and set up to be able to integrate with your account? But sometimes that's not super easy, because completely different environments running completely different ways, and you have to kind of migrate that into your existing system, which is extremely difficult. And then we're back to tech debt again. So there's a lot of little things. That's why the permission boundaries are the way they are, and that's why we bring up those edge cases, because it has happened and we've seen it, and it's the types of things that you need to be on the lookout for.
Yes, and as you were speaking, we continued on the venture because you named a lot of key points that our travelers would go through, right? Is we're thinking of, okay, how do we kind of research and go through all these things or through down CloudTrail? Because it's like, all right, what are the API calls? What are these things happening within the environment? Kind of doing some of the investigation. You mentioned some wacky things happening. Guard duty should kick up if some wacky things are happening. And then I also threw in detective there, right? It's a little bit to the side, but I think in terms of just investigating the environment for those potential gaps, or if something has happened, to say, hey, this is an unusual trend. I think using some of the mechanisms to figure out, because what you're trying to define within your quest is, what is the norm within my environment? Because if I brought in 50 new accounts from different stakeholders or different governance models, all these items applying down into my environment, now you're going to start to have some questions. As you mentioned, when you start to figure out all these little edge cases, they're not really edge cases because they're your standard operating model, right? There are some edge cases, to be fair, but a lot of the edge cases that you usually hear are patterns that are known. Hey, I need to have these offshore users access in my environment without being exposed to sensitive information. I need these administrators to be able to respond in case of an incident. All these are pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to figure out, and you're trying to understand those gaps that we spoke about. And this is usually where you get to that moment where you say, hey, we need permission boundaries. And I think, what are usually some of your signs, Russ, for that, hey, we need permission boundaries, kind of like yesterday moment? Like, what do you think of when it comes to that?
So I'm also trying to keep within the scenario, right? So you're thinking about this. This is a healthcare company. They can't have outages, to be able to restructure their accounts and their data, right? Because people are relying on this information to be able to make life and death decisions. So with that in mind, we have to start thinking, okay, well, now that we don't have the ability to completely rebuild, that's not an option we can use. So how do we phase in these different accounts and organizations, and like you said, all of these different systems, right? Because you may have your nice clean system built out, but maybe that doesn't work with someone else's system because you acquired their company. they had a different model because they were doing a slightly different thing, right? So now you have this situation where you're like, we can't make too many changes because it could, cause an outage in production, which is absolutely not acceptable with, lives on the line. And then, but we also have to protect what is already existing there. So once you see that kind of disconnect, like, how do we do this? That's kind of when you're looking at those, those permission boundaries, and that's when you're like, okay, well, we can at least set, for example, SCPs, bring these into our accounts or into our organizations, start creating OUs for different, whatever, like this is the OU for this parent company or child company or new set of instances that we got from a merger, whatever, it doesn't matter. But that's kind of the way, you got to be thinking about that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not going to be one size fits all. Sometimes you have to sit and kind of monitor what API calls. In order to reduce, you have to understand. And you have to understand before you have an auditor ask, hey, how do you prevent delegated administrators from creating roles that exceed their own privilege level? Well, said auditor, this is how we do it. Those are the things that you have to think of, right? And I think in this scenario, you nailed a couple of different things, is understanding the anatomy of your environment, the anatomy of your permission boundaries, and understanding what, let's say, gatekeepers are within your environment. What are the boundaries? What are the pieces of the void when it comes to least privilege? And how do you understand that you're controlling all the governance within it while giving developers the ability to move fast and also tend to their customers? And their customers, in this case of a healthcare organization, are patients. So you don't want to necessarily just put a blanket block there. You want to understand and have a targeted rollout. And how do you do this? Whoa. It's an interesting question.
First thing, this is just something that bothers me sometimes about security. I know it's not the prevailing mentality, but I see it enough. Security is there to support the business operations. Security is is an enabler. Security shouldn't be detracting from their ability. So if you have, this example where we get 25, 27 new accounts, that's not something that you can just be like, well, these are trash and we need to completely redo this. You have to make do with what you have at times, and not just because of lack of resources or anything like that. It's just you have to start new, find out what this new system is, how it works, what is expected and routine, because how are you going to find malicious if you don't know what it's supposed to look like? So yeah, sorry, just when you said that just all came up.
Yes, it's the flashback scene, right? In any good episode where it's just like, I remember this happening. And what I remember happening is the conversations of, well, I'm just going to bypass security and just create my own role. And that's how you have that one developer with 14 roles, because I needed to do this. And those are the things that we hit the pause game, Zach Morris timeout button, right? Because we have to stop the music, stop everything. Because we want to kind of dive into that. And this is where the concept came in. And I know that you're trying to still figure out, 40 minutes into the episode, what does the title have to do with this? Well, let's find out and dive in a little bit. Because domain expansion, it's built on layers. And what those layers are they're guaranteeing conditions are met within the environment, right? If you take that concept and apply it to your permission boundaries, to your identity structure, to everything, then you start to see, okay, what is the exact picture I want to paint within my environment? Because I am controlling kind of the shape of everything. So if we take that step back, that's the layering technique that we keep mentioning from the defense in depth standpoint. So if we have different tiers, right, of administrators and developers and read-only for auditors and things of that nature, you can shape those items within your domain in order to have least privilege kind of uh, enforced, because you have access to all of those different roles and permission sets and so on and so forth. So if you have something like, hey, auditors can only have access to describe resources. Okay, what resources do they need to describe? Do you want to put necessarily just describe wildcard? No, you kind of want to limit them a little bit more. Just a tad bit more, right? You don't want them to get everything, right? Get star with wildcard. That's also another dangerous thing that can take place depending on how you implement it. Because you're like, oh, I only granted read only, but that wildcard star could say read only into sensitive PHI information. So understanding how these layers work is, I would say, the fundamentals of understanding how to expand your domain without losing your governance standards. And thinking about it just from a process and workflow procedure standpoint. Okay, I need to create a role. What does this role need to do within my environment? And then once you understand that, you can have the different mechanisms kind of clamp down and apply without wildcards, hopefully. So I say it 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet, as I always do, because it's a really important pattern. And one of the things is, if you look at taking that one micro step, and then you think about it from, okay, a macro level, you start to see, okay, I see the circle, and I don't want things to leave this circle. So now we can start to think about, okay, this is my principal org path. This is my principal ID, right? These condition keys that you can implement so things don't leave your domain, your circle, your environment. And you start to think of that from a data perspective and your data perimeter, your identity perimeter, all those things. And that's how you start to get to your advanced patterns. And then you can put in some denies and all those good things. But it's awareness overall, arkingly, of your environment and what limitations you're putting in and what control, right? It's all architectural patterns that you're putting into place. So with that being said, now, Russ, what is your stance on kind of just-in-time access patterns?
Yeah, I think those are a strong method. So that's the type of you bring it up because it's the type of thinking that you need to have in this sort of thing. Like, this is, the point that we're trying to get to is not just the basic, hey, this is what, these boundaries are. Like, this is the next step up, the how do we bring this from, like, your own, I don't want to bring it too much into sci-fi. We're kind of the fantasy spectrum of things. And if I start talking about, multiverse and dimensional membranes, it doesn't really fit. But that's how I like to think of it, right? And so, you're trying to do things that are a little more advanced, that give you a little bit more control over your void. So, you have things about, like, how do you self-service IAM? So how do you allow teams to create and manage their own roles, but also using permission boundaries to prevent anything from getting out of hand? So it's those sorts of, like, guardrails that you want to enact, these pipelines that you want to, get into, things like SCPs, enforcing boundary attachment, config rules to detect whether, things are drifting or changing from the way that they're supposed to be, auto remediation, which I like to talk about at length, so I'm not going to, things like that. Ensuring that you also have access to the tools that you need to be able to manage these permissions, these boundaries, if you will, because they're not really permissions, but boundaries, enforcing those permissions. So you need IAM Access Analyzer. You should be using CloudTrail and looking at your event logs. and don't just ignore your IAM logs. Those are really important. I know there's a ton of them, but when you're looking at things like, hey, how many times has this assume role happened in these accounts, and why does this one specific user have way more than everyone? Those sorts of things. So, and actually taking the time to hopefully persistently and regularly, walking through and evaluating those policies, and ensuring that, not only do those permissions and those policies make sense, but do we need to do more or less with our permission boundaries? Because maybe you need less, or maybe you're building a new development team and they need more. Those sorts of things, very contextual based on the organization. So that's why you have to go through and look at all of these different, patterns and analyze, whether it works not just for, in general, but also for your environment and your situation and,
yeah,
your 27 new accounts.
Yeah, exactly. And there's the known kind of, okay, you're going to crawl, then you're going to walk, and then you're going to run. It's figuring out where you are on that spectrum and then kind of moving on from there. Because for just-in-time access, you kind of have to have an understanding of the different roles within your environment and what permissions they have, things of that nature. Because if you are just putting together a workflow just for the sake of putting together a workflow, then you're going to have these gaps that we were speaking about. And then going back to kind of the fundamentals and understanding kind of that certificate knowledge, basic stuff, right, is an important part, because that's part of that fundamental crawl phase. So when you get to, let's say, the step function workflow creation piece, then you start to get to some more advanced concepts and being able to read and pass session policies and allowing S3 objects a certain way. Or even getting to a point where, hey, what is our break glass procedure, right? How do we grant temporary access at an elevated variety without having that persistent in such a way that somebody can take advantage of it? It's understanding those different pieces of the puzzle from those who came before you, right? So I guess this is for those who come after, because you go on a knowledge quest, and that's kind of those pieces that you figure out, because somebody took the time to kind of write up all these pieces of documentation or things that of our interest of the same exact things that you're trying to implement into your environment. So for those who come after, I think part of it from an identity perspective is just figuring out, hey, what is something like, I don't know, IAM, right? I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. So let's dive into what IAM is, right? Because this is Knowledge Quest. So Knowledge Quest, we go into those different pieces of articles to figure out, one, what are the things that we should know? And then two, figure out, okay.
The excitement for IAM is just palpable. Yes,
exactly. Right? It's just everybody wants to know, how do I become an apprentice gatekeeper, right? And you get that L100 knowledge. And that's where it starts. It's just understanding, hey, what is this? Why should I use it? And how do I use it? And when do I use it? And so on and so forth, right? So getting to that point is an important part of the puzzle. But figuring out, hey, how do policies and permissions work? How do IAM roles work? How do service control policies work? This is all part of being an apprentice gatekeeper. And it's the reason why this ties in. Because if you were to take last week's episode of, hey, how do I maintain my permission boundaries? How do I say thou shalt not pass, right? In our best, Rings voice. Well, you have to become an apprentice to know who should pass and who shall not pass. And this is kind of the work, the fundamental items that you put down in order to get to the point that you become the wielder of conditions, the wielder of policies, the wielder of your domain. So continue on with that. You start to dive in a little bit more into policy of like logic, let's say. And I say policy like logic for the reason of, hey, you want to get to the point where it's this, Yeah, enough said. No, to evaluate a little bit more is you want to know that if I put a deny statement, this is going to affect this, or if it's not, it's allowed, then it goes on to the next evaluation piece. And that's where you start to get to that evaluation logic, right? So this is an important part to understand, especially when you're looking at all the different pieces of identity-based policy and permission boundaries and just overarchingly how these fit together. And that's how you become a wielder of conditions, because you understand how to evaluate. And then you can start to weave in to your knowledge base a little bit of, okay, how do these other services work in conjunction with this? How does config work? Where does it work? I think these are all pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to figure out how to establish, so that you're not only the keeper of the rings, but you're also, I was going to say the evaluator of your domain expansion, but it's a working title. So you use the keeper of the rings because it's the one ring to rule them all. Well, what you want to know is, how do I make more policies so that it's many to many instead of one to many? Because you know what usually happens with one to many? It doesn't work out, right? You have one SCP to block, and that one SCP has a flaw because, oh, what does the condition say? Well, these people can go past it, and now it's gone. So that's where you start to get into the advanced items. You start to get into, hey, how do I use something like control tower? How do I have these layers added into my environment? I think those are the pieces that you take the step back, a little further back, right? So you get to the point that you have kind of the knowledge built from your quest, right? You built your aura, you went through all those processes and procedures, but you also started to automate it. You started to shift left, right? Through the DevSecOps Chronicles. I keep throwing titles out there, so one of them will stick with you. But also to the fact that when you're thinking about your AWS environment, it's not just a one-size-fits-all. It's something that's built over experience. Going from crawl to walk to run is going to look different for everybody. It's going to take different pieces of time. But what helps you to drive in the correct direction is the different baseline fundamentals, the SRA, your frameworks where you're trying to follow, right? Are you following high trust? Are you following NIST? All those things help you to go along the way to eventually build the experience points that you need to level up and eventually become, I would say, a little bit of a master of the technique of your domain. But there's kind of, I wouldn't say a cheat code, but a fast way to do that. And Russ, what is that fast way to kind of level up?
Yeah, so the way you become the master of your domain is creating an incident response plan. But having said that, I know we have like a minute left, but I just got to say, I feel like I've come out of this episode so rich. I just keep, picking up those golden nuggets that you're dropping, and it's just like fantastic.
Yeah. And then
Wonderful.
Then it goes pointing out. All right. We'll be here all week. But I think as you pick up the golden nuggets that we're, putting down, I think come back next week and hopefully they don't bounce out of your pocket or your mind. So until next time, have a great one.
I'm not crying, I promise.
But until next time.